It was a bright and sunny morning when Sarah, a 29-year-old pregnant black woman, stepped into her car. She had just finished her routine checkup at the clinic and was heading home. She had always been careful when driving, knowing how easy it was for things to go wrong, especially with the way people sometimes treated her because of her skin color. But today, she was just focused on getting home safely to relax. Her due date was fast approaching, and she couldn't wait to meet her baby. As Sarah drove through her quiet neighborhood, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car behind her. The sound of the siren made her stomach drop. She pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Just stay calm, she told herself. Sarah had been stopped by police before, but this time, she felt a strange sense of unease. She hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong. What could this stop be about? The officer, a young man in his 20s, stepped out of his patrol car and approached Sarah's vehicle. He was new to the area, and Sarah didn't recognize him. The officer knocked on her window, and Sarah rolled it down slowly, trying to mask her nerves. She knew the drill. Be polite, don't make sudden moves, and answer any questions calmly. But the officer's voice was stern as he asked for her driver's license and registration. "Is there a problem, officer?" Sarah asked politely, her voice a little shaky. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back and seemed to look her over for a moment. His hand hovered near his holster. Sarah's heart raced, but she tried not to panic. She didn't want to make things worse. She took a deep breath and handed him the necessary documents, hoping this would be over soon. "Please stay in the car," the officer said abruptly, his voice cold. Sarah nodded, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. The officer began to walk back to his car, and Sarah watched him. It was hard to ignore the tension in the air, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her mind raced with worry. Suddenly, Sarah heard the officer shout, "Step out of the car now." Her heart skipped a beat. She was confused, unsure of what was happening. She wasn't sure what to do. Was he asking her to get out of the car because of something she did? She knew she hadn't broken any laws, but in that moment, her mind felt foggy. She hesitated for a split second, trying to figure out what to do. The officer's voice grew louder, demanding she step out. Feeling trapped, Sarah opened the door. But as soon as she moved, the officer's hand shot to his weapon. In a terrifying blur, he fired, and Sarah collapsed to the ground. She felt a sharp pain, and then everything went dark. The officer stood frozen, his heart racing. He hadn't meant to fire his weapon. The gunshot had been a reflex, a panicked decision. But it was too late. The woman was lying on the ground, motionless. It wasn't until he knelt beside her, looking at her bruised and bloodied face, that the horrifying reality hit him. He had just shot a pregnant woman. The officer's hand trembled as he reached for his radio to call for backup, but inside, he was paralyzed with fear. What had he just done? The moment the shot rang out, the officer froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a few seconds, he couldn't move. He had always trained for situations like this, but nothing had prepared him for the feeling of actually pulling the trigger. His body felt heavy, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he stared down at Sarah, lying motionless on the ground. "Please, no," he whispered under his breath. He dropped to his knees beside her, trying to assess the damage, but he couldn't think clearly. His mind was in chaos. The woman was pregnant. He hadn't even realized it until now when it was too late. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for his radio, his voice trembling. "Officer down. I need backup," he shouted, his words rushed and frantic. His mind raced, and he couldn't stop himself from replaying the events in his head. He had told her to step out of the car, but why? What had gone wrong? His instincts had taken over, and now it seemed like everything was spiraling out of control. As he waited for help, the officer's mind kept returning to the fact that he had just shot a pregnant woman. He had not meant to hurt anyone. He had only meant to do his job, to keep everyone safe. But now, the weight of his actions was crushing him. The officer's eyes blurred with tears as he looked at Sarah's lifeless body, the reality of what had just happened settling in. The minutes felt like hours. Help finally arrived, and the paramedics rushed to Sarah's side. They immediately assessed her injuries, and their faces tightened with worry. It was clear that she needed urgent care, but the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The officer remained on his knees, unable to look away from the scene. He could hear the voices around him, but they felt distant, as though he were trapped in a nightmare. Sarah was quickly loaded into an ambulance, and the officer was left standing alone on the roadside, his hands still trembling. The other officers took charge of the situation, asking him questions that he couldn't answer. He had no words to explain what had happened. How could he? His whole world had turned upside down in an instant. Back at the station, the officer sat alone in a small room, trying to process everything. His mind replayed every moment, every word, every movement. He could still hear the sound of the gunshot, still feel the cold metal of the trigger. He had made a mistake, and he knew it was a mistake that could cost a life. But what made the situation even worse was the realization that he had shot a pregnant woman. His panic deepened. He tried to tell himself that it wasn't intentional, that he had acted out of fear, but deep down, he knew that wouldn't be enough. The consequences of his actions were far beyond what he could ever have imagined. The weight of guilt and fear crushed him as he waited for the news. Would she survive? What would happen to the baby? He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's face, the confusion in her eyes, and the terror that must have run through her just before everything went dark. He closed his eyes, wishing he could go back in time, wishing he could make it all right. But he couldn't. The damage was done. When Sarah's family received the call, everything seemed to fall apart. Her mother, Gloria, was the first to pick up the phone. The voice on the other end was calm but serious as it delivered the devastating news. "There's been an incident involving your daughter," the officer said. "She's been shot, and she's in critical condition." Gloria felt her heart stop. She dropped the phone as the world around her spun. Her daughter, her beautiful, smart, kind daughter, was in danger. Gloria had always worried about Sarah driving around town, knowing the risks. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. "Mom, what's wrong?" her younger son, Mike, asked as he rushed into the living room, concern spreading across his face. Gloria tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She could only shake her head and hold up the phone. Mike's face went pale as he heard the news. He immediately grabbed his keys, his hands shaking, and they rushed to the hospital together. Meanwhile, Sarah's father, Derek, was at work when he got the call. He was on a lunch break when his phone rang. The voice on the other end sounded official, but there was no denying the urgency in their tone. Derek's first thought was that it couldn't be real. His daughter, pregnant with her first child, was supposed to be at home, preparing for the baby. But now, in a flash, everything had changed. He didn't even stop to grab his things. He just ran to his car. His heart raced as he drove, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Why would Sarah be shot? What had happened? Was she okay? His thoughts collided with each other, but he could barely focus on the road. When they arrived at the hospital, the family was led to a small waiting room, far too small for the anxiety and fear filling the space. Gloria and Derek sat on opposite sides of the room, staring blankly at the walls as they tried to process what was happening. Mike paced the room, his fingers constantly running through his hair. The doctor eventually walked in, his face serious. He didn't waste time with small talk. "We've stabilized her for now," he said. "But we need to be clear with you. She's in a coma. She has a head injury, and the baby is also in critical condition." The words hit the family like a storm. Derek felt a lump in his throat, but he fought to hold back his tears. Gloria's face turned pale, and she covered her mouth with her hands. "How is she? What about the baby?" Gloria whispered, her voice barely above a sob. "We're doing everything we can, But we need to wait. It's all up to her now, the doctor replied. The weight of his words hung in the air. The family's world had shifted so suddenly, and the hospital room felt colder than it ever had before. They had no answers, only silence and the terrifying unknown. In the days that followed, the family continued to wait, hoping for any sign that Sarah might wake up, that the baby might survive. Every phone call, every visitor, brought a mixture of hope and fear, but one thing remained clear: the family wasn't going to give up. They would fight for Sarah, for the baby, for each other. As the days passed, their love and determination grew stronger, even as the uncertainty of the situation loomed over them. As the days passed, the story of Sarah's shooting began to spread beyond her family's small circle. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was everywhere. The details of what happened were unclear, but the shocking headline was enough to grab the attention of the public. Pregnant woman shot by police officer, left in a coma. Local news stations reported the incident with urgency. There were interviews with neighbors who had witnessed the police car pulling Sarah over. Some people recalled hearing the gunshot, but no one could agree on exactly what had happened. The air of mystery surrounding the shooting sparked more questions than answers. Sarah's family, who had been too focused on her recovery, suddenly found themselves at the center of a media storm. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, desperate for an interview or any comment from the family. But they weren't prepared for the attention. They just wanted to focus on Sarah and her recovery, not deal with the media frenzy. The constant attention was overwhelming. Gloria, Sarah's mother, did her best to stay calm as the questions came in. How is your daughter? Do you think this was an accident? Is the officer at fault? These questions hit hard. Gloria didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how to explain what had happened. She had barely had time to process the situation herself, let alone respond to the media. Derek, Sarah's father, was equally frustrated by the constant questioning. "We just want to know if our daughter is going to survive," he said during a brief statement to the press. "Please respect our privacy. We're just asking for time." But the reporters didn't back off. The news spread quickly on social media, with people from across the city, and even the country, sharing their thoughts and opinions on the situation. Some voiced outrage, accusing the officer of overreacting, while others defended him, saying that it was a mistake. The internet exploded with heated debates, and hashtags like #JusticeForSarah trended on Twitter. In the midst of the growing attention, protests began to form outside the hospital. A few people, mostly from the community where Sarah lived, gathered to show support for her and her family. They held signs demanding answers and accountability. "No more police violence. Protect our families," they shouted. The peaceful protests grew in size as more people joined in, hoping to bring attention to the case. Despite the chaos outside, Sarah's family kept their focus on her recovery. They didn't want to get involved in the public debate, but they knew it would be hard to ignore the growing spotlight. The news reports continued, with every update about Sarah's condition being broadcasted to the world. The officer involved in the shooting was identified, and soon his picture was circulating online. People began to learn more about him, his background, his training, and his rookie status. Some believed that the officer was unprepared for the situation, while others questioned why he had even drawn his weapon in the first place. The family's world was becoming a whirlwind of emotions. They didn't know how to navigate this new reality where their private lives were suddenly on display. They only wanted Sarah to wake up and for the baby to be okay. But with every news update, the pressure built, and it was clear that things were only going to get more complicated. As Sarah's family sat in the waiting room, anxiously waiting for any sign of her recovery, they knew that the road ahead would be long. They didn't know how the media storm would affect their lives, but they were determined to stay strong and focus on what mattered most: Sarah's health and her future. As Sarah's condition slowly stabilized, her family found themselves facing a new challenge. The media coverage had not only brought them unwanted attention, but it also created a pressure they hadn't anticipated. It was hard enough dealing with Sarah's recovery, but now they had to consider legal action. They had to figure out how to handle the officer who had shot her, and what justice, if any, would look like for their family. The first thing they did was hire a lawyer. His name was James, and he had experience with high-profile cases. He sat down with Sarah's family and explained what they were up against. "This is going to be a long process," James said, "but we'll fight for your daughter's rights, and we'll make sure her story is heard." His words brought a little comfort to the family, but they knew that a legal battle wasn't going to be easy. Sarah's parents, Gloria and Derek, had never dealt with anything like this before. They didn't know the ins and outs of the legal system. All they knew was that someone had caused their daughter and their grandchild a great deal of harm, and they wanted justice. Derek, who had spent most of his life working hard to provide for his family, found himself focused on one thing: making sure Sarah and her baby received the justice they deserved. While the family was dealing with lawyers and making difficult decisions, the officer involved in the shooting was placed on paid administrative leave. He wasn't fired yet, and no charges had been filed against him. This added to the family's frustration. They knew it wasn't right to let the officer off so easily. It was clear that something had gone horribly wrong, and the officer had to be held accountable. The media continued to cover the story, and public opinion was divided. Some people believed that the officer had acted out of fear and that it was a tragic mistake. Others, particularly those who knew Sarah and her family, felt that it was an act of overreach. They demanded action, calling for the officer to be charged with something more than just a mistake. The tension in the community was palpable. Sarah's family decided to focus on the legal route. They filed a formal complaint with the police department, demanding that the officer be charged with reckless endangerment. James, their lawyer, prepared for a possible court case, gathering witnesses, statements, and evidence to prove that the officer's actions were unnecessary and dangerous. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the officer had acted too hastily, without properly assessing the situation. The emotional toll on Sarah's family was heavy. Gloria struggled with sleepless nights, torn between hope for her daughter's recovery and the anger she felt toward the officer who had caused all of this. Derek spent his days focused on the legal process, but at night he would sit by Sarah's bedside, holding her hand and whispering that everything would be okay. Mike, Sarah's younger brother, tried to remain strong, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He had always looked up to his older sister, and now he was determined to protect her and the baby, no matter what. As the family prepared for the long journey ahead, they knew they couldn't predict what the outcome would be, but they also knew that they had to keep fighting. For Sarah, for the baby, and for themselves. They weren't going to let the system brush their pain aside. Every day was a step closer to the truth, and they were determined to make sure it was revealed. Just when Sarah's family was starting to lose hope, something incredible happened. After days of waiting in the sterile hospital room, watching the machines that monitored her every heartbeat, Sarah's hand twitched. It was subtle, almost like a dream, but it was enough to send a wave of excitement through her family. Her mother, Gloria, was the first to notice. She had been sitting by Sarah's side, quietly praying, when she saw the small movement. At first, she thought it was just a reflex, but then she saw it again. Sarah was moving. Derek, Mike, Gloria shouted, her voice trembling with disbelief. Sarah moved her hand. Derek, who had been standing near the window, rushed over to Sarah's bed. He looked down at his daughter, still unconscious, but now there was a tiny spark of life in her. The doctors were immediately called in, and the nurses checked Sarah's vitals again. The news they brought was promising. Her brain activity was showing signs of improvement. While Sarah was still in a coma, the fact that she was responding to stimuli gave the doctors a reason to believe that there was hope. The doctors told the family that Sarah's recovery would be slow, but the progress was a miracle. "We can't guarantee anything," they said, "but the fact that she's responding is a positive sign." For the first time in days, Sarah's family allowed themselves to breathe. The weight of worry and fear lifted just a little. Derek stood by his daughter's side, holding her hand as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. Gloria wiped tears from her eyes, whispering, "We're here, baby. We're not going anywhere." As the days passed, Sarah continued to show small signs of improvement. At first, it was just subtle movements, her fingers twitching, her eyelids fluttering, but every small step felt like a victory. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. They explained that Sarah was still far from being fully awake, but they believed she could recover if given the time. The family spent every moment at her bedside, cheering her on in their own quiet ways. Mike, Sarah's younger brother, made it a point to read to her every day. He would sit next to her and talk to her about everything that had happened since the shooting. He told her about the news, the protests, and the outpouring of support from the community. He even played her favorite songs on his phone, hoping that the familiar sounds would reach her. It was in the middle of one of these visits that the unexpected happened. Sarah's eyes slowly opened, and she blinked at the bright lights above her. The world around her was blurry, and she felt groggy and disoriented, but there was no mistaking it. She was awake. "Mom, Dad." Sarah's voice was faint, barely a whisper. But to her family, it was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. Gloria and Derek rushed to her side, tears streaming down their faces. "We're here, sweetheart," Gloria said, her voice filled with relief. "You're safe. You're going to be okay." Sarah blinked, trying to adjust to the dim light in the room. Her head felt heavy, and her body ached, but the pain didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alive. And her baby had survived. As Sarah tried to make sense of what had happened, the doctor entered the room. He smiled warmly at her. "You're one of the lucky ones," he said gently. "You've made it through the worst. Now we'll help you heal." The news was a turning point for Sarah's family. The fight for justice wasn't over, but now there was hope. Every day was a new step toward healing, both physically and emotionally. Sarah's family could see that their daughter and granddaughter were strong, and they knew they would fight together, no matter what came next. Days after Sarah's miraculous recovery, the officer involved in the shooting was still struggling with the weight of what he had done. The media frenzy, the protests, and the public outcry all weighed heavily on him. He couldn't escape the images of Sarah lying motionless on the ground. No matter how much he tried to explain his actions, deep down, he knew that it wasn't enough. He had made a terrible mistake, and it haunted him. The officer, whose name was Daniel, had joined the police force because he wanted to help people. He had always seen himself as someone who followed the rules and worked to protect his community. But now he felt like everything he had stood for was slipping away. His reputation was on the line, and nothing could take away the guilt that gnawed at him every day. The pressure from the department was building. Internal investigations were underway, and the police chief had made it clear that Daniel's future in the force was uncertain. But it wasn't just the department that Daniel was worried about. It was Sarah. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the young woman he had shot, and the child she was carrying. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had acted out of fear, not reason. He had panicked, and in that moment, he had done something that could never be undone. One afternoon, as Daniel sat in his small apartment, he made a decision. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine. He needed to tell the truth, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. He needed to take responsibility for what he had done. The next morning, he called the news station. He asked for an interview, knowing that this would be his chance to speak out. His request was granted, and within hours, a reporter was sitting across from him, a camera rolling. "Why are you coming forward now?" the reporter asked, her voice steady and calm. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "I made a mistake," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I acted out of fear, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I shot a pregnant woman. And I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't make up for it, but I need people to know that it wasn't intentional." He paused, his eyes welling up with tears. "I've been living with this every day since it happened. The guilt is unbearable. I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just scared, and I made a terrible decision. I wish I could take it back." The reporter sat quietly, giving him a moment to collect himself. The weight of his confession hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world had stopped. This was the truth, raw and unfiltered, coming from the person who had caused so much pain. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," Daniel continued. "I wish I could tell Sarah and her family how sorry I am. I can't undo what I've done, but I can at least tell the truth, and maybe in some way, that can start to make things right." The interview ended, and Daniel's confession was broadcasted to the world. The reactions were mixed. Some people were moved by his honesty, while others remained angry and demanded justice. But for Daniel, it didn't matter what the public thought. The only thing that mattered was that he had taken the first step toward making things right, even if it was too late. Meanwhile, Sarah's family watched the interview on TV. They didn't know what to feel. Part of them felt a sense of relief, knowing that the officer had finally admitted his mistake. But the other part of them still felt the pain of everything they had endured. It would take time for them to fully process Daniel's words, but they knew that they couldn't change the past. What they could do now was focus on Sarah's recovery and the future. They were ready to keep fighting for justice, no matter how long it took. After Daniel's public confession, the spotlight on Sarah's case grew even brighter. The media coverage intensified as the officer's admission of guilt echoed across the news outlets. For many, it was a moment of relief. He had finally taken responsibility for his actions. But for Sarah's family, it was only one step in a long journey. They knew that words were not enough. They needed real justice for what had happened to their daughter, and for the baby that she had fought so hard to protect. Sarah's lawyer, James, was ready to take the next step. "We can't stop here," he said firmly. "The officer has admitted his mistake, but we need to make sure the law holds him accountable. This is about more than just an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." James worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and preparing for what would surely be a long legal battle. He knew that the court case would be complicated. On one side, there was the officer who had confessed and expressed his remorse. On the other side, there was the reality of Sarah's pain, the trauma she had experienced, and the consequences of what had happened to her. The public was divided. Some believed that Daniel's confession should be enough for justice to be served, while others argued that the officer needed to face stronger consequences. The legal process moved slowly. Court dates were set, but delays were inevitable. Sarah's family was often left sitting in the courthouse, waiting for hours, sometimes days, for hearings to begin. Each delay felt like another weight added to their already heavy shoulders, but they refused to give up. Sarah had shown incredible strength by waking up from her coma and starting her recovery, and now it was their turn to be strong for her. In the courtroom, James made it clear that the family was not looking for revenge. What they wanted was accountability, and most importantly, they wanted change. "This isn't just about one officer's mistake," he told the court. "This is about ensuring that people are held responsible for their actions. This is about protecting our families and making sure that no one else has to go through this." The judge listened carefully, taking note of the family's concerns. The officer, Daniel, sat quietly in the defendant's chair. He had no defense left. His confession had already spoken louder than any lawyer's argument. Now, it was up to the court to decide what the consequences would be for his actions. As the trial went on, Sarah's family spent their days focusing on what they could control. Sarah continued to recover, her strength growing with each passing day. It wasn't easy. There were still physical challenges ahead, and the emotional scars of the incident would take much longer to heal. But Sarah was determined to move forward. She didn't want to let what had happened define her. One afternoon, Sarah's mother, Gloria, sat by her daughter's bedside, watching her as she slowly regained her strength. "You've been through so much, sweetheart," Gloria said, her voice full of emotion. "But you're a fighter. We all are." Sarah smiled weakly. "I'll be okay, Mom. We'll all be okay," she whispered. The family was beginning to find peace in the middle of the storm. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop now. They were still fighting for justice, but they were also fighting for Sarah's future, a future where she could live without fear, a future where her baby would grow up in a world that protected them both. As the trial neared its end, the family hoped that the judge would see the officer's remorse, but also understand the need for a fair and just outcome. The fight was far from over, but they were determined to see it through to the end. For Sarah, for the baby, for justice. The trial was finally over, and the family waited for the judge's decision. It had been a long journey, full of ups and downs. The pain of what happened to Sarah would never go away completely, but she had come a long way in her recovery. The physical scars were healing, and slowly, the emotional ones were starting to fade too. When the judge delivered the verdict, it was clear that justice had been served. The officer, Daniel, was sentenced to a period of probation, but he would also have to attend counseling and undergo further training. It wasn't a harsh punishment, but it was a reminder that he had to be accountable for his actions. The court also ordered that the department review its procedures to prevent something like this from happening again. Sarah's family, while not fully satisfied, felt that at least some change had been made. As the legal matters were resolved, Sarah and her family turned their attention to healing. Sarah, who had once felt broken, was beginning to feel whole again. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she had learned something important. She was stronger than she had ever realized. Her recovery was slow, but every step forward was a victory. She spent more time with her family, enjoying quiet moments and focusing on her future. She knew that things would never be the same, but she was determined to move forward, one day at a time. The baby was born healthy, a beautiful reminder of hope and new beginnings. Gloria, Sarah's mother, felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had spent so many sleepless nights by her daughter's side, praying for her safety. Now, as she held her grandchild in her arms, she knew that everything they had been through had led to this moment. Sarah had survived, and so had the baby. They were both going to be okay. Derek, Sarah's father, was equally relieved. He had spent so much time focused on the legal battles, but now he could finally focus on his family. He saw how strong Sarah had become, and it filled him with pride. He knew that his daughter's journey wasn't over, but the worst part was behind them. The media had moved on, but for Sarah and her family, their journey was just beginning. They had learned so much from the ordeal. They had learned how to fight for what was right, how to stand up for each other, and most importantly, how to heal. The community that had supported them throughout the entire ordeal continued to rally behind them. Sarah received letters and messages of support from people who had followed her story, and many expressed gratitude for her strength and courage. It was clear that her story had made a difference. As Sarah looked at her baby, she smiled. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The road to healing was long, but it was hers to walk. She had been through something terrible, but now she had a chance to build something beautiful. And with the love of her family, the support of her community, and her own strength, she was ready for whatever came next. The final chapter of this painful chapter was ending, but for Sarah and her family, a new story was beginning, one of recovery, strength, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.